Hello and welcome to another episode of Linux and Code. Today we're continuing the series on building a JSON API with Express, and today we're going to be talking about sorting. Let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is start up our project just to have it running so we get live updates and everything as we add things in here and to kind of let us remind ourselves where we were. So that server is all started up, and if we rerun our basic request on API user, for example, we get back our list of users that we generated before, and we get a created at and an updated at time, and we implemented paging last time, and so these are all coming in about 20 per page, and they're being currently sorted by this created at date. And if you remember, we did that because since we're using UUIDs, we can't just sort on ID because that wouldn't give us any specific order, at least that we could tell. So this is the order we're currently getting it in on a created by. So if we come in here to user and we look at our read file, we can see this sort created at -1. Now why -1 and not 1? Well, this is actually another Mongoose shortcut, and there's actually about 4 values you could put in here. You could put in 1, you could put in -1, you could also do ASC for ascending, or you could do DSC for descending. You could also type in ascending or descending. All of those are valid options. Now, our -1 is actually equivalent to descending, and 1 is equal to ascending. So that's just kind of an easier way to type it in. And the way you can easily remember that is if you're doing 1 or ascending, you're doing 0 to 9 or A to Z if you're doing alphabetical. And if you're doing -1, you're doing 9 to 0 or Z to A. And that's just kind of a nice, easy way to remember. So in the case of times for created at, a newer time is always a higher number value. So -1 is going to give us our most recent first, even though it's a descending order. So that's what we're currently doing. But for users, doing a created at sort doesn't really make a lot of sense if you're wanting to look at a user table. Most people would want to see that in terms of alphabetical. So we're going to change this sort to be by username instead of created at. So we're just going to set this key to username, and we're then going to set it to 1. And if we come over here and we run our API request, now you can see we get Abigail as our first and Abby as our second. And that's exactly what we would expect. Now if we wanted this to be the opposite, so we wanted to start with Z, we could do -1, rerun that request, and Zula is now our first user that we get back, which is exactly what we want to see. Now we could also do, as I mentioned before, descending, and run that, and we get the same Z first order. So those are a quick little definition on what ascending and descending is in terms of how we can implement this sorting, and here I've given it an invalid value. As you can see, if we do ASC, then we go back to A to Z sorting. So that's a nice intro to what our sorting values do. Now, what if we wanted this to be dynamic instead of hard-coded? Well, let's dig into that. So for now, we're going to change this back to what it was before, just username -1, so we're back where we started. But now we want to make this so that a user of our API can define what it's sorted by and whether or not it's ascending or descending order. And this should be pretty straightforward to do. We're going to need to declare another constant, and this is going to be our sort. And we're going to call it req.query. This is why we did query on the other paging result that we did last time, because this lets us build more than one thing into a single API endpoint, and it's much easier to do that this way. So now we need our sort by, and we're also going to get our order by. Now, I'm also going to set some defaults in case these aren't passed in, our API will still work. In this case for user, I'm going to set that to be username, and I'm going to set it to be ascending by default, or ASC. So we have these values, now we just need to make our sort use them. So how we're going to do this is going to look a little bit different than normal. We're going to clear out this default sort value, and we could do it there, but I like kind of declaring things separately. So we're going to make a new constant, and this is going to be our sort query, and it's going to be equal to an object. And this is going to have in here our sort by, and that is going to be equal to our order by. Now what this is doing is setting a dynamic key, so whatever is passed into sort by in these brackets is going to then be the key in our object, and the order by is going to be the value. So now that we have this sort query defined, we can pass it in here and save it. And remember, our last request, we were doing Z to A. So now if we run this again, we're back to alphabetical by default because we're sorting by username and ASC, which is what we want. Now we can, now that we've done this, we can pass in a query, so sort by, and if we wanted to say created at and run this request, now this is completely different because we're now sorting on this time, and this is currently doing ASC because that's still our default. So let's change this and say our order by is equal to descending. Send that request. And now this is telling us we have an invalid sort value. I maybe have a property named incorrectly. Let's just try -1 and see if that works. It does, but DESC should work as a string. So what's going on here? Let's try passing it without the quotes because I think I know what's happening here. Yeah, so it works without the quotes because a URL parameter is by default a string, so passing the quotes with it is adding those quotes to our order by, and Mongoose doesn't know what to do with a quoted descending order. That's not a thing that it recognizes. And we'll cover some of this stuff later in a validations episode, but we're not quite to that. So now that we've done this change to our user, we should give the same thing over to our items. So we're going to just copy this code because it should be the same. And we're going to go over to our read on items. We're going to drop this in. And the only thing we're going to change here is the default because we don't want to sort by a username here. Here we want to, by default, sort by created at. And we also need to update this sort to be our sort query. Save that. Now, what could we search for on item other than created at? Well, for one thing, we could do item type. So if we come over here to our requests, and let's see, here's our item request. Let's send it to see what our default is. We have some notes, and we have a ton of different content. So what if we sort by item type? Let's send that request. This is still the same, so let's flip the order on its head. Also the same, because the only item type we have right now is note. So let's change it instead to be content. And you notice this changed. Now, content isn't something I would necessarily recommend sorting on, and you could add a filter to not allow content as a sort, but by default, Express isn't opinionated here, and what we've written isn't opinionated, so you can change it however you like. Okay, that's been basic sorting with Express. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to leave a comment, or subscribe. If there's something else you would like to see, let me know. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Take care.